Okay, now you're very welcome along to an off-the-ball interview we have with a writer, Tom Mooney. Tom's a Wexford man and a bit of a motorsport enthusiast, it's fair to say. Um, I guess the news that broke earlier this month was the death of Stirling Moss, a renowned Formula One driver who was 90 years of age. Um, and when you hear the stories Tom is about to tell us, it's quite extraordinary, in fact, that Stirling did live to such an old age. We're going to talk about the 50s, which by all accounts, were quite a horrific period for Formula One racing in terms of the death rate and how dangerous that row was for those drivers. But Tom, you're very welcome. And I guess first
Thank
of all,
you.
can I just ask you, Tom, about Stirling Moss, and this is the month of his passing, and maybe the legacy he has on the sport of Formula One.
Well, his legacy is huge. I mean, he's probably known as the most famous Formula One driver not to win the Formula One championship. But that shouldn't negate his achievements because he was skilled in many different disciplines of driving, Monte Carlo, sports car racing, sports car testing. And remember as well that in Formula One, I think he came second four years in a row in the championship and came third 3 years after that. So in 7 years of racing, he was either second or third. He missed out in 1958 by 1 point. And there are two reasons why he never won the World Championship. His time happened to coincide with the greatest driver of them all, Fangio. And also Moss had this predilection for driving British homemade cars because there was a huge level of patriotism among drivers, because this is only 10 years after the war. So when you see racing cars today and their livery and their colors, Ferrari have red because the color representing Italy after the war was red. The color representing Mercedes, the Germans, was silver. The color representing Britain was green, France blue, America white. And that still exists today. He was a phenomenal driver who happened to live in the shadow of a genius. And when I say a genius, Fangio won 5 world titles, but he won them with 4 different teams. He started off with Alfa, Maserati, Ferrari, and of course Mercedes-Benz. And but Moss was extremely talented. I remember there was a famous but bloody Belgian Grand Prix in 1960, and Moss crashed out and broke both his legs and was seriously injured. And this was a race in which 2 other drivers were killed. 2 English drivers were killed, Alan Stacey and a chap called Chris Bistow. And this was at Spa, where Antoine Hubert had that fatal crash last year. So the death of Chris Bistow, his car came off the track and it catapulted him out of the car, and he was decapitated by barbed wire. And that was the level of health and safety trackside. But anyway, Moss broke his legs. He was only able to compete in 3 of 9 Grand Prix that year, and he still came third. He came third just competing in 3. Can you imagine had he competed in all 9 where he would have come in 1958, when he lost by a point to Mike Hawthorne, who was another Englishman and a friend of Moss's as well. Moss won 4 Grand Prix that year. Mike Hawthorne won 1, but Hawthorne was accumulating points for fastest lap, and he was second and third at a time. If Moss wasn't first, then Moss sometimes he would treat a car harshly and badly. So if he wasn't first, chances are he would crash out along the way. Hawthorne, you could argue, was a little bit more conservative and was picking up those points. But he was a brilliant driver, and I saw Moss as recently as 4 or 5 years ago at Goodwood. I used to go to Goodwood Festival Speed every summer, because that's the place to see the old drivers like Moss and John Surtees racing the cars they raced in the 50s. And he was in good form, and I met him once or twice. Really, really nice fella, a brilliant ambassador for the sport. And maybe to conclude about Moss, Moss's attitude to danger was this. He used to say that when you're playing with your life, it gives racing a whole new meaning. And that, in one way, that's kind of scary. But that seemed to be the attitude of a lot of drivers in the 50s.
I mean, we'll get to the very bloody year, as you describe it, of 1955 in a moment.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about the psychology behind these guys. And, one of the things you had said to me in your notes was that this was a profession more dangerous than being a pilot at the height of the Battle of Britain, and certainly
Yeah.
in terms of life expectancy. When you talk about, the right stuff on wheels, as you put it, I mean, this is a few years before, I think it's 1961, when Yuri Gagarin became the first person to fly into space, and you had the Americans then launching astronauts into space as well. Those guys certainly had the right stuff.
Sure.
But these guys were in a profession that, by all accounts, is far more dangerous. I mean, I'm sure these drivers were aware of the inherent risks, and were there many of them that would perhaps bow out of the sport as a result of the risks, or did that just encourage them even more?
No, I can't recall a single incident of a driver in the 1950s withdrawing from the sport. When I think of 1958, Moss raced for a British team called Van Wall, and Van Wall had a driver who was burned to death in the last Grand Prix of that season. Yeah, I think it was at Morocco, and as a result of that, Tony van der Velde, who owned the team, he withdrew from racing. And there are instances like Bernie Ecclestone. Bernie Ecclestone was very involved in Formula One at that stage, but he also saw a friend of his who was killed, and he withdrew from racing at the end of 1958. So you do get incidents where people involved in the margins would withdraw. But the ordinary racing drivers, not at all. I mean, I was talking to you earlier on about the tragedy at Le Mans, in which a Mercedes driver, Pierre Levat, crashed into the crowd, killing maybe anything from 80 to 90 people. And there was pressure on Mercedes to withdraw at about 2 a.m. And one of the drivers who was putting pressure on the team not to withdraw was Stirling Moss, because he'd never won Le Mans. But the attitude prevalent at the time was, you can't bring the dead back. I think I was curious about researching a book about these guys, because I was wondering, where did this attitude come from? And it was spawned by, there was a driver called Roger Williamson. He was an English driver. And in 1973, he was racing in the Dutch Grand Prix. His car overturned and went on fire. One driver stopped to try lift the car and couldn't lift it. And Williamson either suffocated or burned to death. And you can see that footage even today, because it was live on television. And I watched it and I wondered, where does the mentality come from where you have drivers who must have known this guy quite well, who continue to drive around in circles while this car is on fire and the driver is underneath? And then I realized I had to go back into the early 50s for that type of mentality. And Shane, I think you don't have the 1950s without that generation coming just from the war. The likes of Moss was 21 when he drove in his first Grand Prix, and he was surrounded by other really talented Englishmen, Peter Collins and Mike Hawthorne. Had they been old enough, they would have hopped into a Hurricane, or they would have hopped into a Spitfire. Remember, they were all from the London area, so they would have watched the Battle of Britain from their gardens. They would have seen men die horribly. They would have had neighbors who fought in the Battle of Britain. So in a sense, they came into Formula One in 1950. This is the 70th anniversary of Formula One this year. They came into Formula One in 1950 already hardened by life, in the same way that COVID-19 will affect teenagers going forward. The experience of the Second World War hardened these people. So they became, I'm not saying they became immune to violence, but to a degree, they were able to move on. You know, they had an attitude. They would have read stories about Battle of Britain pilots, especially in Spitfires. And when they realized they're going to crash, they used to send out this message to their colleagues saying, "I'm about to buy it, chaps." You know, and it was very gung-ho. There was no crying or anything like that. And they were the same. They never complained. And they would turn up. Sometimes they didn't have managers. They didn't have press agents. They were guns for hire. Sometimes they didn't know what car they were driving, not unless they belonged to a team. And they would hop into a car and they would give it everything for 3 hours flat out without a break. I mentioned a race there to you called the Mille Miglia. The Mille Miglia was 1,000 miles from Brescia, North Italy, down to Rome and back. So Moss, that's 1,000 miles. Moss did that in under 10 hours, flat out, without a break. And that race was then abandoned 2 years later because a Ferrari driver, Protego, was trying to do the same thing, crashed into a crowd, and I think killed something like 10 people, including 5 children. And even up as late as 1961, when Phil Hill became the first American to win the World Championship in the very last deciding race at Monza against a driver called Von Trips, whose nickname was Von Crash. Von Trips skidded into the crowd, and I think 16 were killed. So the danger has always been there. And Moss famously compared the danger to putting salt on a meal. And if you took away the danger, you took away the taste, the salt.
I mean, you mentioned that Le Mans horrific tragedy there, which I think was it Mike Hawthorne that went on to win the race, or certainly Mercedes decided to continue with the race as well. And you know,
Yeah.
you see the footage on YouTube of you know, ambulances carting away the dead and dying, and yet the race in the foreground still continues. This 24-hour Le Mans race. I mean, when you see that, and I think you put it as, you know, the most shameful or lap of honor in history, where they had the champagne and stuff to celebrate the win at the end, and yet all these people had died, these innocent spectators. Was there any, I guess, apology after that for the teams that decided to continue? Was there any remorse shown that maybe we did not make the best decision that day to continue the race, considering so many had been killed?
No, in fact, what happened was the circuit was probably blamed because it was out of fashion. It was a very narrow. The start was on a straight, which isn't very wide. So even if you see the footage today, it's remarkable how close the people are to the actual circuit. And that you could argue that it was an accident waiting to happen, because the big difference between, say, Le Mans in 55 and Le Mans in 54 and 53, Mercedes had introduced their new cars, the SLR. And I was saying to you earlier on that Moss had managed to go from Brescia to Rome in under 10 hours. That's 1,000 miles. Well, that's the car they brought to Le Mans about a month later, and it's a real speedster. So they're going at speeds on a course that wasn't designed for those speeds. Like Le Mans was a public road designed for speeds of maybe 90 miles an hour in the 30s. So you have these cars capable of reaching 170. And Jaguar were the team to beat. So Jaguar with Mike Hawthorne and Fangio in the SLR, they were wheel to wheel coming up to the tragedy. And what happened quite simply was that Fangio braked suddenly because he had disc brakes. They were a new innovation. With a disc brake, you could perhaps decelerate the length of this room here quicker than drum brakes. And the car behind him was an Austin Healey. He couldn't brake as fast. So he had to swing out to his left to avoid Hawthorne, who came in front of him, and LeVay then rode over his car like a ramp. So in a sense, it was the perfect tragedy in that you couldn't have conspired for that accident to happen intentionally. And then the car just catapulted into the crowd, and an awful lot of people were killed and hundreds injured. I mean, we're only talking about the 84 dead. There were hundreds injured. I was at Le Mans a few years ago. I went looking for the memorial, but it's kind of a very small memorial. But racing kind of got on with it because, as I said to you, they then had one of the next rounds of the sports car championship was at Dundrod in Ulster, and the grid was over 50 cars, and again that was a public road, and three drivers were killed in that one race, but the race still continued, and two of the drivers burned to death.
I mean, you've spoken different times about this bloody season of 1955, and I mean, that's obviously not the only season in those years where tragedies happened. Even if you Google the likes of Mike Hawthorne, you'll see, although he survived that day in Le Mans, that, you know, he would pass away a few years later from an accident himself, like many others. But that 1955 season, I mean, tell us a little bit about the likes of Alberto Ascari, the first dual Formula One world champion, the likes of Bill Vukovic, who, of course, was very famous for his exploits in the Indy 500. But I guess when you look at the stats around these guys and around their incidents and around 1955 in general, it really puts into stark contrast just how dangerous this sport was.
Yeah, well, you look at Ascari. I mean, I think people forget that the last Italian winner of a Formula One championship was 1952. And so it's a mentality thing. it was discovered that French, particularly English and German drivers had the right mentality to win Formula One as it got faster. So in fact, the Italians are the old school pre-war. But Ascari, he took part in the Monaco Grand Prix, and he was driving, I think he was driving a Lancia who just left Ferrari. And it's a scene that's been replicated in several movies, including a famous one from the 60s called Grand Prix, where he comes out of the tunnel and whatever happens, he shoots across and into the harbor. So that's on a Sunday, and the frogmen drag him up, bring him to hospital because he's got a broken nose and he's bruised ribs. But he was under so much pressure to get back on the horse that the following Wednesday, I think, he was test driving, this time a Ferrari, for a sports car race. And going around a corner, he was catapulted to his death and he died. Then about, I think, a few weeks later, Bill Vukovic was taking part in the Indianapolis. He was going for 3 in a row. And there was a sequence of events, a bit like Levey at Le Mans, where Vukovic didn't do anything wrong, but other cars in front had an accident. And again, he catapulted over and his death. So it was, an extremely bad year in terms of they didn't have enough time to do anything about safety because they had these enormous casualties. I mean, the most famous driver besides Fangio in F1 would have been Ascari, and the most famous driver in Indy would have been Vukovic. And then, of course, you have Le Mans, and that changes an awful lot because although Mercedes win the Formula One championship that year with Moss and Fangio, and also they win the sports car championship, at the end of the year in December, they theatrically and very dramatically, they mothball all of the cars and they withdraw from sport, and they only returned with Schumacher over a decade ago. So it was a very bloody time. I think one stat that I found shocking when I was researching the book was the grid at, I think the grid at Monza for the Italian Grand Prix in 1956. And when I think of those drivers today, the Ferrari team consisted of Peter Collins, consisted of Luigi Musso, Eugenio Castelletti, Alfonso Portego, and Von Trips. They all died behind the wheel of a Ferrari between 1956 and 1961. You mentioned Mike Horton. He won the championship for Ferrari in 1958, but his best friends was Peter Collins. Peter Collins and Musso were his buddies on the Ferrari team. Musso was killed that year at Rem. Collins was killed that year at the Nürburgring. Horton won the championship with a point to spare over Moss, retired, and at home outside Guildford was dicing with another car when his Jaguar hit a tree, and he too was killed. So the roll call of death is phenomenal. I seem to recall an interview about 10 years later with Jackie Stewart, and I can't remember the exact figure, but I'm pretty sure that Jackie Stewart said, looking back in his life, he knew 63 racing drivers who he would have called friends who were dead.
That's extraordinary, really extraordinary figures. I mean, when you think about the one thing that struck me from looking at the videos even is, and when you look at the figures and the spectator deaths, I mean, there was a quote from Stirling Moss as well that he was kind of talking about Le Mans and saying, well, there was an incident at the Farnborough Air Show a number of years back, and lots of people were killed by a crashed airplane, and yet they continued. That was just the British attitude, I guess. But I mean, was there an element of the spectators in attendance that knew the danger in even attending a sport so close to the track? I mean, was it the same strange, macabre element to the human condition that sees rubbernecking even today, of people taking videos and photos of car accidents? I mean, were the people there to see the race? Were they motorsport enthusiasts, or were they there to see a crash?
No, I think they were definitely there to see the race. I mean, we've had a few footballing tragedies in our time, and I remember watching the Bradford fire unfold on television, as I remember watching the Hillsborough tragedy unfold with George Hamilton trying to do some type of commentary. And last year I looked at the Bradford fire again, because it starts off as a small blaze in the corner. And I'm kind of wondering at that stage, why do people haven't left and why did so many people die? And it's because it was an incident without precedent. They knew no better. You could argue with Hillsborough that when they were cramming people in there, they had always done that. It had always worked. They knew no better. So to a degree with Le Mans had been running from the late 20s right through to the tragedy in 55. They had always crammed people very close to the track. But as I said earlier, what had changed was the development in speed. The development in speed was accelerated by what they had learned during the war. So, for example, one of the drivers who was a driver for Mercedes at Le Mans was an American driver called John Fitch. John Fitch was also a pilot, and John Fitch became famous because he became the first pilot of a Mustang to shoot down an American Messerschmitt, which had been turned into a jet plane. So there's nothing like war to accelerate technological development. And the Second World War gave a whole new generation of car designers, because they'd worked on the Spitfires, the information to introduce aerodynamics. So if you look at cars pre-war, they're kind of squatty because they don't know what aerodynamics is. So if you look at the SLR that crashed at Le Mans, it's very sleek, very, very low. It was made of aluminium. And one of the reasons the German picked silver as their color, because they had worked out that silver was the lightest paint color. And that was the reason they chose silver as sort of their national color. So yeah, technological changes, and also a younger breed of driver, because the older breed was sort of slowly dying out. I mean, Ascari was killed. Jean-Pierre Wimille, who was a hero of the Second World War, he was killed in Argentina. Varzi was killed in Switzerland. So this generation were coming through and filling the shoes of an older generation. The one exception in all of this is Fangio. And Fangio was an excellent driver. He didn't make mistakes. He made one in which he ended up in a body cast for about 6 months. But besides that, he didn't make too many mistakes. But there's a very poignant scene towards the end of his life. He was at a circuit called Rem in 1958. It was the French Grand Prix. And he was a member of the Ferrari team. But it wasn't so much he was slowing down, but the spirit was going out of him. And he saw Luigi Musso in the Ferrari car take a hairpin, too bad, and he was killed. And you could literally see the spirit of Fangio leave him. And that was the last serious Grand Prix he ever took part in, because Musso was killed. And Fangio used to refer to the likes of Musso and Collins and Hawthorne as his sons, because they were young enough to be his sons. And if you think about it, if you think about the French Grand Prix in 1958 and the beginning of the season in 1959, those three I mentioned, Hawthorne, Collins, and Musso, they were all dead. You know, they were all dead. And Fangio left the sport then, but he was a genius, and I do think Moss was also a genius because he could do anything. You know, we were doing this experiment at a circuit called Montreuil in France, and they wanted two drivers to drive a Jaguar for 24 hours nonstop, so they would share it. They wanted to find out how long the engine could last. So Moss and another driver, they did it for 24 hours, and I think they did 2,500 miles, just swapping and changing. Then 2 years later, Jaguar wanted to do the same experiment at the same circuit, but they wanted to do it for 7 days nonstop with 4 drivers. And Moss volunteered for that. And I think the car drove for something like 16,000 miles without stopping. And then finally, there's a famous, he won the Pescara Grand Prix, which was sort of, there was no points for the championship, but he won it anyway in Italy on a Sunday. By Tuesday or Wednesday, he was at the Bonneville Salt Flats, where he had volunteered to be locked into an MG supercar, and the next day he broke 5 land speed records. So in a sense, he was primed by nature, like Fangio, to do these things. That's what he was put on the planet to do, and never thought twice about it.
I mean, the safety level of Formula One races has obviously increased dramatically in the intervening years. And have Formula One moved fast enough? I mean, obviously nowadays we have the very basic things you would think, like the crash cages and the helmets and seat belts for a start. And in those decades, like the 50s, as we're speaking about, in the 60s as well, which were pretty dangerous, as we've heard.
Yeah,
They move fast enough with the safety restrictions. Obviously nowadays it's far better, but back then, did they move quickly enough in your opinion?
no, not at all, not at all. I mean, I remember there was a great Italian driver called Varzi, and he was killed at Bern. And they reckon the only reason he was killed, this is I think about 52, they reckon the only reason he was killed was because he wasn't wearing a safety helmet. So after that, they introduced safety helmets. And there's a great quote from Moss, because really his dad is sponsoring him at this stage. Moss says to his dad that he doesn't want to wear a safety helmet because it's a bit sissy. Now, granted, he's only about 20 at this stage, and eventually he does go on to wear safety helmets, but the safety helmets that they wore in the 50s weren't really very, very safe, because in some cases they didn't wear seatbelts. So, for example, in 55, when Mercedes designed this SLR for that 1,000 miler in Italy for Moss, and he had a navigator called Jenks, who was also a journalist. The Germans had put in this special seatbelt to protect the two lads, and the design of the seatbelt had been inspired by German pilots in the war. And Moss and Jenks had told the Germans that they needed to remove the seatbelts, because they said in the eventuality of a crash, they'd rather be thrown and take their chances than be upside down and burned to death. Because you've got to remember as well that the fuel they were using in the 50s, I mean, at least 50% of it was as good as alcohol. Fuel is highly flammable. The flames you would have seen, say, at Le Mans in 55 at the crash with Levey and the Mercedes-Benz was made of aluminium. If that goes on fire and you pour water on it, it's even worse. You're talking about safety. I remember there was a famous race in the 60s when Jackie Stewart at Spa, again, Spa seems to come up all the time. He went into a forest and upside down, and nobody noticed that he was missing. And he was afraid of the car going on fire because he couldn't get the steering wheel out. Eventually he did, but thereafter, at certain races, Jackie Stewart would tape a spanner to his wheel so he could take out the wheel himself to get out of there. And then Roger Williamson, if you ever look at the footage of Roger Williamson dying in the Dutch Grand Prix in '73, the car's on fire, he's underneath. The one driver stopped to try lift him, but he can't. And the marshals come over with fire extinguishers, but unfortunately they're wearing rain macs, which then begin to melt towards the heat, so they can't use the fire extinguishers. And then you have Niki Lauda in '76 at the Nürburgring. He crashed and he nearly died, and that was the last Grand Prix at the Nürburgring, because the Nürburgring, I think, was 14 miles long. It took so long for the ambulances to get around to him. In fact, if you ever look at the footage of Lauda's crash, it's other drivers who stop their cars and pull him from the flames, perhaps remembering the same death that Williamson had got 3 years earlier. So no, it took a very long time for Formula One to improve their safety. Ultimately, what did it again was technology. They were able to build cars that if they crashed, they would break up in parts, and so the energy would be dispersed. But unfortunately, in the 50s, when a car broke up, it was usually the body that took the brunt of the dispersing energy, and drivers could be destroyed. If you look at the footage of Le Mans in '55, it's horrific, because you see exactly what happens to the driver when he's thrown from the car. And so it took a long time for safety to improve. And I think perhaps the single biggest factor was that the deciding race in '76 between Lauda and James Hunt was televised on TV, and it got huge figures. And Bernie Ecclestone realized as late as then that the future of Formula One was television. And you know what? It didn't look good for television if you had drivers dying. So that's probably a cynical take on it, but I think it's probably a very true take. As I say, Bernie Ecclestone had experienced the personal death of drivers back in the 50s. He didn't want it any more than you and I did. But when James Hunt and Niki Lauda transformed the popularity of the sport, transformed it, they started to introduce safety, especially at racing tracks with more barriers and stuff like that. But drivers still continue to die.
Can I just ask you finally then, Tom, about the book itself? I mean, I know you've said you've done multitudes of research, bits of research. You know, you've drove yourself the Nürburgring, and as you said, you've seen Stirling Moss drive at Goodwood, and you've witnessed the 24-hour Le Mans race as well. So you've done plenty to research for the book. But how did this all come about, and when can we expect to see it on the shelves?
Well, there's two things there, Shane. I remember when I was growing up in Bray in the 70s, and Formula One used to be on the TV, and it was very, very glamorous because you'd be watching a race, say at Monaco or at Monza, and I always think of Bray as being grey and rainy when I was a kid, and yet I could see on the screen that here was a blue sky and a blue sea, and I was fascinated by the colour of Formula One because it was extremely glamorous. So when I was doing the book, I wanted to visit the old circuits from the 50s to try replicate or vicariously imagine what these young men would have gone through when they arrived at Monaco for the first time, or they arrived at Monza, they arrived at Spa, they arrived at the Nürburgring. And we've got to remember as well that most of the tracks today, or with the exception of Monaco, are manufactured for Formula One. Most of the tracks back in the 50s weren't. For example, the Nürburgring is cut out of a mountain. It's 14 miles long. Spa unites 3 villages in Belgium, so they were country roads. And Monaco was what we used to call round the houses driving. There used to be a race called the Targa Florio, which was 40 miles. So I wanted to try and capture the color of the 70s, and I thought I'd have an awful lot of fun going to these old racing tracks. And you know what? I did, and they were colorful, and it was great crack, and I enjoyed every minute of it. The second thing is, what started this was seeing the crash at the Dutch Grand Prix in '73. I didn't see it at the time, but I saw it maybe 10 years ago, and I was wondering, how do drivers keep going round in circles and ignoring the plight of another driver who frankly is burning to death? Where does that mentality come from? It didn't come overnight. And then I realized, you go back to Le Mans in '55 and continuing with the race, if you think about it, the guy who caused the crash eventually wins and does a lap of honor. Where does that mentality come from? I didn't have an answer, and I wanted to have an answer. And then as I was doing the book, I realized I really got to like their company. I admired them. I admired Hawthorne, Moss, Collins, because they had an awful lot of courage. You needed, excuse my language, you needed big balls to do what they did. I mean, I have done the Nürburgring a few times, and whenever I've done it, my stomach's in my throat, because it's daunting. Even today, it's a tough circuit, and they would do it flat out. I mean, Moss won. There was a race known as the Nürburgring 1000 miler, and Moss won it 3 years on the trot, driving flat out in a sports car. And I often wonder, how did he do that? I mean, 3 years on the trot, incredible stuff. So I wanted to write a book as well that I would enjoy the company of the people I'm writing about. That might seem a strange thing, I didn't dislike any of them, and I admired them, and I admired their zest for life. There's great camaraderie there, and they would help each other. They were always good at pulling over and helping another driver. It wasn't victory at all costs, and I admired that. And they had a simple love of driving, of the beautiful cars they had in the 50s, of the lifestyle. And they didn't seem to think too much about tomorrow because they weren't really professionals. They had other jobs, with the exception of Stirling Moss. So hopefully I'll be able to finish it this year, because I've been a journalist up until about 2 years ago, so that took up a lot of time. So I have a bit of free time at the moment, and if I can finish it, maybe now during the COVID-19 sabbatical, I'll be happy.
Mm-hmm. Well, listen, Tom, really.
And secondly, yeah, I mean, I've always loved Tom Wolfe's to write stuff. And I found it amazing that a guy could write about the space exploration program and make it so riveting. You know, that's a challenge as well. Would I do something like this again? I don't think so, because every year the technology changes, the car changes, the drivers change. There's so much to remember, and you find yourself cross-referencing all the time and ending up like something like an anorak. So after this, I'll do something simple, maybe one individual, and stick with that.
Well, listen, Tom, we'll definitely keep an eye out for the book, and we'll have to get a copy of it sent into Off the Ball when all this is
absolutely
done.
Absolutely, Shane.
Well, listen, Tom Mooney, thanks a lot for giving us your time this afternoon, and very best of luck with finishing the book.
Thank you, Shane.